Thanks so much, John, for the introduction. I'm really happy and honored to be a guest of the Institute of World Politics today. We've got Professor Wilson and my friend John, two esteemed professors here. I worked with John for many, many years, and I've taught a guest lecture to a class or two over here, so I'm familiar with the students and met some of the students, or at least some of your graduates up on the Hill, and I think this is a great school that really prepares people and improves their careers in national security. So thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. I will speak for maybe about 20 minutes and then open it up to questions and answers. Blinking red is, or at least attempts to be, the authoritative history of the Intelligence Reform Act of 2004, which you may remember was the seminal moment when we as a country decided that these were the two things that we were going to create, institutions that we were going to create to address the intelligence failures of 9/11 in Iraq. Those two institutions, of course, are the Director of National Intelligence and his office, and the National Counterterrorism Center, which I'll get into in the course of the talk. I was in the Legislative Affairs Office at the White House at the time and had the good fortune, the luck really, to be a party or a fly on the wall in all of the meetings at the White House after the 9/11 Commission announced its recommendations in July 2004 and followed the legislation or the development of the policy into legislation all the way through a roller coaster congressional ride that ended in December 2004 and created the law. I thought at the time it would make a great story, not only because it was the first most substantial revision to, at least pertaining to the intelligence community, since the 1947 National Security Act, but it was also sort of an interesting legislative tale. It had a protagonist in the 9/11 Commission, a group of nationally prominent men and women who over the course of more than a year held a series of very high-profile hearings and built a national audience and had an agenda of what they wanted to achieve, namely their recommendations to restructure the intelligence community. You had an antagonist in the Department of Defense and those who supported a view of intelligence that was more along the lines of the Department of Defense and what we need to do to be able to protect the troops. We had a cast of colorful characters, from Donald Rumsfeld to a variety of people in the Congress. We had a special interest group in the 9/11 victims' families who were very, very aggressive in advocating for the 9/11 Commission's recommendations. We were on the heels of not one but two intelligence failures, two of the largest intelligence failures in our history, and all of this was happening against the backdrop of the 2004 presidential election, when John Kerry and George Bush were facing off. And really one of the main questions of the 2004 election was, had George Bush made the country safer? And this, therefore, sort of became a stalking horse for a larger debate about the role of the United States intelligence community and national security in a larger sense post 9/11. So I took a look at all those factors and thought that this might make a great book, not only for students of intelligence, but students of government and the Congress, because truly the heart of the book is a legislative history, how we ended up with the provisions that we ended up with that now govern how the intelligence community works. But let me back up for a second and explain what the 9/11 Commission's rationale was and its recommendations, and then I'll cover the three schools of opposition to what the 9/11 Commission recommended. And then I'll talk a little bit about how the new law, the new position, the Director of National Intelligence, has functioned in its first, say, 5 years of its existence. The 9/11 Commission noted that the problems on September 11th, namely the failure to connect the dots and the inability to sort of knock down stovepipes were the new national security imperatives that we needed to face as a country post 9/11. They marshaled these arguments in support of an idea that had been around for decades, which was to create a new super spy, a sort of spy master who would govern across all now 16 agencies or elements of the intelligence community. Of course, INR is one. We've got a former head of one of these entities here today. But the 9/11 Commission decided that the structure that we had created in 1947 no longer suited the post-9/11 era. Okay? So what did we do in 1947? I think you'll recall that when we created the Department of Defense and the National Security Council, we also created the CIA. Everyone knows the CIA's most prominent, sexy functions, of course, the recruitment of human spies around the world and covert action. But the law, and later practice, gave the Director of Central Intelligence a second hat, a second mission was given to the DCI, and that was to coordinate across the intelligence community and to be able to evaluate intelligence that rose up from different collection mechanisms across the government, namely those in the Department of Defense that we now call sort of the national intelligence agencies. Of course, everybody knows the most famous one now, thanks to Edward Snowden, the National Security Agency. And of course, you probably know, of course, NGA, which analyzes satellite photography and makes maps for us. And the other ones are the Department, DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and the NRO that build satellites. These, of course, grew up over time in the post-World War II era, but what the 9/11 Commission decided is that the DCI's role under the 1947 system, that the DCI had too many hats to wear. It was too demanding of a job to be able to manage the CIA and also figure out a way to manage other departments. The job was inherently difficult, and this is sort of the essence of the fight that we saw in 2004. The job was inherently difficult because the vast majority of the intelligence collection mechanisms in the intelligence community resided in another department, in this case the Department of Defense. So indeed, there were two masters, so to speak. If you were the head of the NSA or the NGA, you reported to the Secretary of Defense, especially for Title X functions, and you reported to the DCI for other functions, mostly of a national level and a tactical level. That's sort of a simplistic way to understand some of the different functions in the intelligence community. But the 9/11 Commission thought that in a post-9/11 era, when we had stateless terrorists, stateless counter or proliferators, that we needed a new agile system. We needed a new spy master who could move money very quickly, could move people across the community very quickly in order to meet new threats. The 9/11 Commission decided, and this was a very, very key judgment, that these community management functions needed to be separated from the CIA. So the system we had since 1947, for all of its limitations, the ones I mentioned about trying to manage intelligence agencies that reside in another department, when that department head has another boss, they at least, in the 1947 system, the Central Intelligence Agency, the DCI, at least controlled the CIA. At least had the troops and the analysts and the others in the CIA to control. But the 9/11 Commission said, let's separate it out from Langley. We're worried about CIA capturing the new DNI. We're worried about the mixture of domestic intelligence with foreign intelligence. And let's create a new freestanding entity separate and apart from CIA, whose job it is to break down stovepipes and manage the intelligence community more as a cohesive whole. This idea was immediately celebrated across Washington. The 9/11 Commission rented out, one of the biggest, most grandest venues here in town at the Mellon Auditorium. The nightly the noonday newscast broke in live on network television to cover the 9/11 Commission's recommendations. You can imagine all of you who've served on commissions or read commission reports that no one's ever heard of. This is just sort of the most instantly celebrated, important commission that's ever come around. John McCain and Joe Lieberman endorsed the commissions completely that afternoon. John Kerry, who at the time was about to be the Democratic nominee for president, endorsed the 9/11 Commission recommendations 17 minutes after they were announced. President Bush endorsed the 9/11 Commission's recommendations almost in total, largely in total, some 10 days later. So immediately in July 2004, you have an instant juggernaut in favor of what the 9/11 Commission has just recommended. Most of the Senate endorsed what the Commission wanted to do in the form of a D&I and an NCTC. And after President Bush endorsed the D&I in concept, the work fell to the National Security Council at the White House to hash out the details. And this is where the rubber met the road, where the bureaucratic interests in Washington really, represented their true colors, so to speak. And there was a bit of a brawl in the NSC behind closed doors in the White House Situation Room over a 6-week period as we filled out what a D&I would do for at least as far as President Bush was concerned. And we converted that into a piece of draft legislation and sent it to the Congress. So let me touch briefly on the 3 camps that broke out in opposition to the 9/11 Commission's recommendations, because they're really instructive about how we function as a government, how we function as an intelligence community, and it helps explain some of the problems we are arguably facing today as we grow under a new intelligence system. The first most prominent camp, as I mentioned a minute ago, was the defense camp. This was primarily led by Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. This was actually, a fun thing to research for me. Don Rumsfeld, of course, is a very colorful character. He's known to, as you all know from your study of national security, send snowflakes out to people. Those are the terms for, sometimes 1 to 2 page memorandum from the secretary to his subordinates, or in this case, the president, saying, here's what I think. Secretary Rumsfeld was adamantly opposed to the 9/11 Commission's recommendations to create a director of national intelligence because he really viewed this as sort of a zero-sum game. He saw, as did Vice President Cheney, by the way, himself a former Secretary of Defense, that any transfer of power or rebalancing of power away from the Department of Defense to a DNI or even to a DCI under the old system would necessarily lead to less control over people and dollars for the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense, his view, Republicans and Democrats, Cheney, everyone who more or less held the position, had the view that the first function of intelligence was to support combat troops, to support troops in the field. And indeed, in some of my research, when I went down to the Bush Library and looked through some of the notes of our old boss, Steve Hadley, these first meetings trying to figure out how they were going to react to the 9/11 Commission's recommendations, Vice President Cheney said at one of these meetings, we cannot be dictated to on the congressional schedule. This is like rearranging the deck chairs of the Titanic in the middle of 2 shooting wars. So you've got Vice President Cheney absolutely opposed to it. And I mentioned a second ago the snowflake. I forgot to tell you what Secretary Rumsfeld wrote in the snowflake to President Bush, and I sort of called this out in the book a little bit because I just thought it was sort of classic Rumsfeld, and you could hear sort of the directness and sarcasm in his voice, and it was sort of the memo was entitled "Intelligence Reform" in quotes, and he said, "Mr. President, John Kerry, members of Congress and the media can afford to be wrong and there is no penalty. For presidents of the United States, you must exercise better judgment, and presidents can't be wrong while these others can afford to be wrong. And he sort of ended the snowflake with just one word, all by itself: caution. I thought that was just sort of classic Rumsfeld, just leave caution out there at the end of the memo. The second camp that broke out was, and this is very interesting, I think, because of who holds the position today, and it was what I call in the book the Clapper-Hayden view. Clapper, of course, at the time was the head of NGA, and General Hayden was the head of NSA. You'd think, based on what I just said, that they might have the view that the first role of intelligence ought to be to support the warfighter, and they were staying put in the Department of Defense. Interestingly, both of them diagnosed the 9/11 Commission's recommendations as a recipe for failure. They said it would be feckless because the center, as they call it, DCI or DNI or whatever you want to call it, would actually have less bureaucratic stroke because you were separating it from the CIA. And even if you didn't, the best thing to grow more centralized power so that you might be able to move people and resources free of relative obstruction would be to move the NSA and the NGA straight into a new arrangement under what we call a Secretary of Intelligence. Clapper and Hayden advocated this view in secret around town. They admitted to me they, had off-the-books meetings at the White House where they tried to convince Fran Townsend and Steve Hadley and others that this was the way to go. They were later out at the Wye River speaking to some intelligence officers who were being promoted, and they got in the Q&A session, someone said, well, what do you think of the 9/11 Commission's recommendations? And Hayden and Clapper said what I just told you, that they thought it wouldn't work and that their agencies ought to be transferred out of the Department of Defense. Secretary Rumsfeld heard about this. And Hayden told me that before he had even gotten to his car, he had a call from the Secretary's office asking Hayden and Clapper to come see him as soon as humanly possible. And this sort of sets up this infamous lunch in Washington where Clapper and Hayden are brought in to meet with Secretary Rumsfeld and his lieutenant Steve Cambone, and they're asked, what do you think of the 9/11 Commission recommendations? Clapper and Hayden say, this is what we're for, and Secretary Rumsfeld rather famously slams down his fork into his plate and says, I can't believe that two general officers or people that have served their country in uniform could possibly recommend such a thing, and dismiss them from the room, and needless to say, that meeting went very, very poorly. The third view, which I'll cover quickly, is sort of the CIA's view, and that was held by, I think most prominently, former DCI Robert Gates. Gates wrote in an op-ed in congressional testimony that summer that the essence of bureaucratic power in Washington flowed from the big behemoth, the Department of Defense, and any attempt to create a director of national intelligence separate from the CIA would necessarily mean less authority, which in his mind was exactly opposite from what the 9/11 Commission wanted to do. In fact, future Secretary Gates wrote that summer that if we adopted the 9/11 Commission's recommendations, the new DNI would be a eunuch. So with these three camps battling in the National Security Council and trying to make their case to President Bush, over a 6-week period, President Bush develops a legislative proposal and sends it to the Congress. That's sort of the heart of the book. I can get into it during the Q&A. Most people thought that Bush eventually went with basically what the 9/11 Commission recommended, which was the creation of a Director of National Intelligence separate from the CIA, with enhanced budget authority and enhanced ability to transfer personnel across the community. It was generally seen as a strong DNI, maybe not as strong as what the 9/11 Commission had recommended, but as I argue in the book, these were sort of very narrow shades. The interesting part of the book really is seeing that, we all hear about in our political science classes the iron triangles in Washington of interest groups, their friends in the department or agency and their friends in Congress banding together to ensure a particular outcome on a policy issue. And so the Department of Defense's view became represented in the Congress primarily by Chairman Duncan Hunter of the House Armed Services Committee, who fought the 9/11 Commission's recommendations as advanced by the U.S. Senate and by President Bush tooth and nail. And the book goes through the 2 or 3 major provisions that were intended to change the current system: budget, personnel, and the relationship of the D&I to not only the combat support agencies that I mentioned, but interestingly the Central Intelligence Agency, which I'll come around to here in the conclusion. Over the course of this 4.5-month period, we have rewritten the National Security Act. We've dethroned the Central Intelligence Agency as the head of U.S. intelligence, created a National Counterterrorism Center, and so this is sort of the most sweeping restructuring of the intelligence community since 1947. And everybody went home in December in 2004 and congratulated themselves on having created a new, or at least changed, a rather large system that had been in development since 1947. Here are President Bush and Steve Hadley and Andy Card are sitting in the White House after the signing of the bill, and they're thinking, who is going to be the first director of national intelligence? And who do they decide to turn to but one of the chief critics of the 9/11 Commission's recommendation? They decided this might be the only person who could make the new system work, and so they called up Bob Gates, who was president of Texas A&M University. And Secretary Gates, I was fortunate enough to be able to interview him for the book, and he said during the course of the interview, I said, is it true that you were offered the D&I, and if it is true, why did you turn it down? He later gave me a lot of the emails he wrote at the time to Andy Card and Steve Hadley explaining sort of the law and his views of it, and I put this in the book. It's sort of a interesting contemporaneous analysis by a former director of Central Intelligence of the new statute that had just passed. He called it, and faulted it, frankly, for being vague. He called the law silly, and he said that for him to even consider taking the job as Director of National Intelligence, the President would have to do a series of things. And he ended the memo with, most of all, the President needs to make abundantly clear that the D&I is not some mere budgeteer or coordinator, that he is the leader of the intelligence community. Secretary Gates said that President Bush made all the commitments that he asked for and that he left for College Station, Texas, thinking he was going to take the job, and he certainly understood that the President, while Gates had to get back to him Monday morning, believed that he would accept the job. Gates explained that he sort of walked around the campus of Texas A&M with a cigar late at night, decided that he did not want to come back to Washington to be the D&I, especially under the circumstances and authorities under which the statute had given him. I'll want to leave time for questions, so I'll just sort of abbreviate. And then we have 4 D&Is in its first 5 years. Under President Obama, the D&I and Admiral Blair makes 2 or 3 very important points to try and adjust the relationship between the Central Intelligence Agency and the D&I, appeals to the White House and loses on both. As General Hayden said, in this quote to me, it's one thing to be able to lose, it's another thing to be able to lose in such a humiliating fashion on the front pages of the Washington Post. I stopped the book sort of with the Clapper era. I'm happy to talk about it, but the book had to stop somewhere. But really the final framing question I would leave for you and for others to discuss is, at the end of the day, did we do what we intended to do as a country? did we create, in the 9/11 Commission's words, a quarterback who could direct different parts of the intelligence community, personnel, resources, policy, in order to make the country safer? Or did we create an office, as its critics would argue, that is merely an unnecessary level of bureaucracy that gets in the way of the operators who are trying to do their job? Or will, like the Secretary of Defense or other bureaucratic institutions, will the D&I in this case accrete power over time and eventually at least somewhat fulfill the vision of those who worked on the statute and those who saw a greater, more substantial role for the Director of National Intelligence? So I didn't get to the NCTC. I didn't get to a lot of different issues. I'm happy to get to those in Q&A, but just wanted to leave it right there and see if you had any questions. Yes, sir, Randy.
Mike, Randy Fort, president of Raytheon, and so I had a stint service in the intelligence community. So it's 10 years this summer, a decade has gone by. That's a pretty appreciable chunk of time. So looking back now, if you had to do over again now, knowing what we know now, how things have worked out over the past decade, what would you have done differently? What would you have recommended differently? What additional responsibilities or authorities should a DNI have had? What authorities was he given that maybe in hindsight he should not have done? I mean, if you could kind of go back and rewrite history right now, what would you do to make things better in your view?
One would have had a more deliberative process. We were under tremendous pressure from one of the most powerful interest groups in American history, according to some of the senators involved, a 9/11 Commission lobbying and amidst a presidential campaign. And when you compare that to Goldwater Nichols, which most people agree is probably the most successful and one of the most famous pieces of legislation we have, certainly one of the most successful in the national security world, when you study how that law evolved over time, it's a 2-year, 2.5-year, really longer process where they went through and really studied it. So one, and this is sort of the lesson for us in Washington as we try and legislate in anger or with political pressure as we look to the Snowden thing, it's sort of a lesson there of we need to go slower, we need to unpack sort of the truisms that we advance. Remember at the time everybody just comforted themselves with the conventional wisdom that, well, I've been around in Washington all these years and the only thing that matters is the ability to hire and fire people and to control their money. And all we need to do is give the DNI some authority to hire and fire and give him full budget authority, and that ought to do the trick. I don't think either of those tools have turned out to be the cudgel that the DNI thought he or she would have, at least when it was being designed. And so it really raises the issue of whether we should have done this in the first place. Perhaps we should have left it at CIA. Perhaps we should have figured out an arrangement where we could have given more bureaucratic authority to the new Director of National Intelligence. But we are where we are. And so when people ask me, well, what can we do now? Do we need to reopen the statute? I think what the book shows is that even when you had all of this momentum of a presidential election and a 9/11 Commission and 9/11 Commission families and John Kerry and George Bush and John McCain and the whole Senate around more or less the same idea, and you still only get what you got, it's very unlikely, short of some terrorist attack that we can't even fathom coming down the pike, that any of the combat support agencies of the Department of Defense are going to get moved out of the Department of Defense and put into an authority, direction, and control relationship with the Director of National Intelligence. So short of that outcome, which I don't think anybody really believes is likely anytime soon, and this happens to be Lee Hamilton's view that I agree with him on, is that this comes down to a matter of presidential leadership. If the president wants to be able to make this bifurcated system work, where we have a DNI who doesn't directly control any of the intelligence agencies, any of the 16 intelligence agencies. The president has got to make clear that the DNI is my guy or my girl, and here are the 2 or 3 or 4 things that I'm asking the Director of National Intelligence to do, and I've got his back. And then that would sort of suffuse power into the DNI to be able to manage across the system. And if we had that situation for a sustained period of time, we might get to a place where the DNI had more authority that he was able to sort of accrete, like the National Security Advisor does, because he has sort of the reflected power of the president. And so I'd like to see those conditions for a while to sort of test the statute to see if it can be made to work within the executive branch before we reopen it. Because I think, as the book shows, this was a unique, sort of perfect confluence of circumstances that brought together to give us what we've got. It's hard to see that replicating anytime soon, and most people, frankly, are still in reorganization fatigue in Washington. The last thing anybody wants to do is create another Department of Homeland Security, create another DNI, or create another CyberZar, or anything else that's out there. So I think it's going to take leadership to make the system work.
Hugh Grindstaff, there's a body that General Clapper came from Booz Allen, and then General Admiral McConnell goes to Booz Allen, and that Snowden worked with Booz Allen. Is there too much concentration,
of power and defense contractors and stuff?
Because cybersecurity has become more of an industry almost than it has a defense mechanism.
Everything about Edward Snowden bothers me.
Me too.
And, we could talk for hours at how damaging this has been. I mean, I'm frankly of 2 minds on how to affix sort of accountability for the Snowden matter. On the one hand, you want to be able to say that the leaders of the NSA and the DNI should be held accountable, but frankly, politics, this has gotten to be such a macro issue of, do you really want someone to lose their job over Edward Snowden when they had no idea what was going on in NSA Hawaii, and then score a big victory for Edward Snowden, who ran off with millions of documents? So it's hard to make an honest accountability judgment in this sort of atmosphere. But no, I think I hear what you're saying, and I probably would agree with a lot of what you're saying. Yes, sir.
In relation to the earlier question, if you look back over the past 10 years, you could plausibly say that the Bradley-Manning-Snowden combination was our biggest intelligence failure. I asked a retired veteran of CIA how to understand how 2 essentially kids, poorly educated in their 20s, high school graduates, were able to take millions of documents and do with them what they wanted to do. And he said it seems that it was the reorganization that facilitated that. He said when he was station chief in Moscow, there were lots of things that his deputy didn't know he was doing. That highly classified things were based on a need to know. Only because of the reorganization could a kid in his 20s get a hold of billions of documents, it would seem. Before that, they couldn't, because the need to know meant every secret was not accessible to thousands of people with security clearances. You had to justify getting access to that secret because you had a reason for it. After that, the sharing, the breaking up of the stovepipes made it possible. And so how would you
Sure, I got you.
that if it is our biggest intelligence failure,
Right.
how would you try to correct it?
So it is the biggest loss of intelligence in our history. I know Ames and Hansen caused the deaths of people, and I'm not taking away from that, and that was very serious also, but 1.2 million documents of highly classified NSA material, and if you believe the newspapers, a lot of the material doesn't have anything to do with signals intelligence, so this is just, I would sign up to most superlatives about this being one of the worst crises to befall American intelligence ever. I don't know if I would put it on the shoulders of the reorganization, however, for two reasons. One, most people think that the D&I, for the reasons I just talked about, has been largely unable. There are new policy directives saying we need to share more information, but most people, when you get underneath the hood, say, well, this particular information sharing directive that the D&I has done isn't necessarily, effective. I would trace this sort of evolution from need to know to need to share to directly post 9/11. I mean, that's the thing about this whole reorganization. This didn't happen until 2004, after Iraq and 3 years after 9/11. One of the lessons we all learned after 9/11 is that we needed to be able to connect the dots better, and that we might have been able to foretell of the plot had the FBI and the CIA shared information better. So the need to share culture came out immediately after 9/11. It's not traced directly to the Intelligence Reform Act of 2004, although that is one of the things that we've asked the D&I to do, and arguably one of the reasons the D&I has not had a tremendous amount of success that you can point to, because information sharing, along with another 12 things, are so hard to do with the authorities that he was given. I don't know if I'd put it squarely on the D&I's back, but we're definitely in sort of in a correction mode now. The Bradley Manning thing is obviously awful. The Snowden thing, I think, is more attributable to an individual who had all the keys to the kingdom, not necessarily oversharing per se, but a guy who was literally the computer guy, the guy you call to fix things and move documents around. And the way I heard somebody say it to me recently is the reason they didn't notice that Snowden was doing what he was doing, because it would have been akin to being in a library and seeing a librarian move books around. That was what he was supposed to be doing, so it didn't raise enough red flags. A lot of people think that the way to get out of this do loop on need to know versus need to share is better technology that allows an analyst who works for INR, who thinks he needs to be in a compartment on the Iranian centrifuge program, to be able to search it, find out that data exists, and then if he's blocked from the data, be able to petition to someone in the bureaucracy that he ought to be able to see it for the following reasons, and then they make a judgment on whether he indeed needs to see it. That's going to be a better way over time, from tagging the data to a regimented system of who gets access to it, rather than going back to sort of the Russia House view of things, which is I need to keep everything in my safe, which is underneath my desk, inside of another safe. And so anyway, I hope that was helpful. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, go ahead. Did I start here? I've already forgotten who I started with. I think I started with you. We'll do counterclockwise. Go ahead, you.
Greetings, my name is Jeffrey Beeman Capella. I'm a 10-year U.S. Army veteran and defense consultant and a graduate here at IWP. First, I'd like to thank you for sending us here the courtesy of your time.
Thanks.
That said, my question kind of dovetails with and is an outgrowth of some of the former questions, and would like to get your thoughts on how we as a country might best insulate the development and implementation of optimal intelligence policy from domestic operating and often foreign funded and or supported political pressure groups whose activities, in my observation, quite often, among other things, complicate the resolution of inter-service and interdepartmental parochial invite.
Who do you have in mind? The House Armed Services Committee?
Well, just in general, I mean, think about, say, the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation, which is a Russian-paid propagandist entity that masquerades as a think tank here in D.C. that, in a lot of ways, we're pushing very particular narratives surrounding the Snowden case.
Right.
And that kind of creates this general political environment that becomes almost impossible to adopt optimal intelligence policy. Because everybody's like, well, the NSA is allegedly the bad guy. I just had a debate with one of my buddies on Facebook about how, he's like, well, he's kind of down the fence on Snowden. Snowden's clearly a traitor. Well, how do you sit there and implement, effective public policy when the average person thinks the NSA is the bad guy? I love the NSA. How do you insulate?
Look, I think you're onto something about, I don't know this particular think tank, but I know that, you know, a lot of responsible people in the media, and even, well, forget about the media, but look at President Obama's speech of now 3 weeks ago, when he sort of cites sensationalism in media reports as part of what's fueling some of the outrage about what the National Security Agency is doing. And so I think, to bring it back to blinking red, and just a general point is, you know, we don't need to legislate in anger. We need to, the intelligence committees, the leaders in the Congress need to step up and digest these issues and consider them within a larger national security intelligence collection framework before running off and doing something because the newspaper said to. When the newspaper, more often than not, and not trying to impugn their motives necessarily, but they, you know, they may not know. I mean, read Lawfare. The Lawfare critique of the New York Times story yesterday about, you know, the Australians spying on the Indonesians, and a U.S. law firm gets in the middle of it. I mean, you know, I hear you. I think it's really hard to sort of legislate on imperfect information. Yes, sir.
Given that the purpose was to sort of identify, at least from what I'm understanding, the purpose was to identify and to and focus the coordination of intelligence operations, so that there was an awareness across not only across the board, but be able to go to a particular focal point to have it distilled down.
Right.
How do you see that being in conflict with our hiring and contracting practices? A gentleman made a comment with regard, for instance, to Booz Allen, and there's many other contexts.
Sure.
Where basically our services across the board, be it intelligence or medical or whatever, is all contracted out on a day-to-day basis, vetted. Contracts are traded usually on very short notice. A great deal changes very, very quickly. So we've had very little control and consistency with our human resources that are delivering and managing the very things that we are supposedly tend to hold very secure. When in one day one person's doing it, next day they're not. And so I see these things as going in sort of at counter purposes to each other. What do you think?
No, there's something to that. I mean, look, members of Congress of both parties have looked to the D&I to try and get a handle on how many contractors there are. I'm sure you saw the report last week where the D&I wasn't sure how many contractors there are across the intelligence community, which really gets back to the whole point of what we're talking about here today, which is, does the D&I have enough authority to collect that data on the people that he is the head of? But the larger point about contractors is that after 9/11, well, first of all, we cut intelligence too much in the 90s, putting us in a situation where, when everybody agreed that we needed to grow the intelligence community very quickly after 9/11, we had no choice but to turn to contractors. So that's point one. The other reason we had to turn to contractors was because, you know, we had not grown up a core of, Arabic speakers or Urdu speakers, and so you had to turn to contractors.
The government could have hired them, the same people that the contractors hired.
It was easier to hire them through the contractor and quicker, and you couldn't get it as quickly. And there are other dozens of examples of why we needed to rely on contractors for different functions over time. That's leveled off, frankly, over time. But, you know, contractors are part of everything the Department of Defense does and many of the things the intelligence community does. People are fond of saying the Department of Defense doesn't make anything. They don't make a bullet. They don't make an airplane. They rely on defense contractors for all of that, and a lot of that is, it's attributable to the threat environment that we're in. When we have so many different threats coming at us in a different way, we've had to rely on American strength, and many times that's been within the government community, the actual people who work for the intelligence community, and sometimes it's been contractors, especially when you needed to go fast.
Seems like they just addressed it as one size fits all. I mean, it's one thing to contract out to make a bullet. It's another thing to contract out on intelligence analysis, where you could really need to have a closer hand on it.
Well, I don't know that, well, okay.
UCIS,
I'm sorry?
UCIS, the clearance, the people who do the clearances, that was contracted out.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I can't defend them. I can't defend every contract. I can't defend any, this individual cases. Of course, there are screw-ups and excesses, and maybe we paid more than we should have and the rest. I'm just generally trying to say that the country had to turn to somebody to meet a new threat, and in many cases, contractors stood up. That shrunk as a proportion. Over time, the intelligence community budget went up to about $81 billion, and it's now, leveling off and going down. And a lot of contractors, I think, their workload has decreased. If you're talking about Snowden in particular, the Congress asked General Alexander, well, why are you relying on someone who didn't graduate from college to do this? And the answer was that you needed people that were young and computer savvy, just to use a term that's out there, and they could get that from contractors, and we aren't sort of growing them up through the system. I don't think, anecdotally, according to some of the people who testified before Congress, that they want to join the GS. They don't want to get on USA Jobs and say, I want to be a contractor that does the IT for $22,000 a year. So some of this is just the system that we have. So right here and then right here. Sorry, we were really making you wait here. I'm really scared of what you're going to ask, so I keep putting people ahead of you here. Yes, sir.
An excellent discussion. I just wanted to go back to one statement you made, where you said that most people who had looked at the 9/11 Commission report have come to feel that they got their facts straight. But I've seen it. The question is, I've seen it in the press many times that a number of the actual members of the 9/11 Commission have said since then that they weren't fully informed of various facts that would have impacted on how the Commission report turned out. So what do you make of their statement?
Well, Philip Zelikow addressed some of these issues so I'd need to pull his statement again and look at it. I have not seen, and I know and interviewed almost all of these commissioners, and admittedly not about the 9/11 plot per se. My book is about their recommendations and the new system. But I have not seen a huge amount of angst coming from the 9/11 commissioners about, here were facts that we were denied, here are things I didn't know. In fact, I know them to be planning on doing a big event this summer that's about their recommendations and not about facts that they feel like they were denied. But it's inevitable with any historical exercise. There's going to be new facts that we're going to learn about the 9/11 plot and the hijackers and the rest over time. I don't know that it's going to change the judgment that they came to in any big, major, significant way, but we'll see. Yes, sir. Sorry. No, it's you. It's your turn. Sorry.
It's partly I have a cold. Carl Golub, a retired criminal investigator, U.S. Customs. I did spend some time at the Trade Center sites in November of 2001, and trying to bring kind of an outside the beltway perspective to need-to-know questions, I guess. Somehow the 9/11 Commission completely overlooked World Trade Center number 7. Are you familiar with it? 47-story steel and concrete building.
Yes.
That day, and to this day, NIST, National Institute of Science and Technology, hasn't released their modeling data, which there are thousands of architects and engineers who would like to have the data to understand that collapse. But secondly, in 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed to President Kennedy Operation Northwoods, which was a domestic false flag terrorism plan to hijack airplanes to inflict harm on domestic military and civilian targets. Kennedy rejected it. And the question then, there's some who have concerns that even some aspects of such an event may have been outsourced. For example, the Saudi entities, information of which is still secret. And third, the former defense minister of Germany, Andreas von Bülow, wrote a 300-page book entitled "The CIA 9/11."
Who wrote it?
International terrorism and the role of the secret services. Andreas von Bülow.
Okay.
He's a former defense minister of Germany, and this came out in 2003. And it's never been printed in English. It was a bestseller in German, 100,000 copies sold in German. And I don't think anyone, any large population within our country has ever been able to evaluate a perspective from that level in a major foreign competent intelligence entity. I have concerns why or how the printing has never occurred in English.
And I have no idea. I guess I'm sensing a trend here. I mean, I hear you what you're saying. The CIA, the U.S. government, the Joint Inquiry, and the 9/11 Commission all more or less have the same fact pattern about what happened on 9/11. I understand there are other alternative theories out there. I don't put a lot of stock in them. I sort of trust the institutions and entities that we created to give us the truth. I'm happy to, I'd love to learn what's in that book. I don't know who this guy is. I'm not sure why I would trust a German guy more than I would all these distinguished Americans who've looked at this, but I hear you, maybe.
Well, my experience is just, going back to the Warren Commission, commissions sometimes have agendas that cause certain things to just be overlooked, like World Trade Center number 7. They didn't even acknowledge it happened. Maybe a 47-story building housed the CIA, Exchange Commission, etc.
So where you're going with this is that the U.S. government was behind some of this?
The government as an entity, no, people do things. I'm not saying anyone in particular was behind anything, but
I hear you. No, I know. Look.
Why it only raises questions and concerns like that when they aren't really investigators. They're a commission, and commissions.
No, they were investigators. They were,
Investigators?
yeah. They were criminal investigators. They were lawyers. Look, I wasn't even a big fan of the 9/11 Commission, so now I'm put in this awkward spot of sitting here defending their work. I mean, I'm the guy who wrote a book saying that they might have gotten some of their recommendations wrong, so I don't know if I'm the guy. Phil Zelikow needs to be invited to the Institute of World Politics to defend the work. I don't put a lot of stock in these theories, but I should just probably leave it at that. And
one more.
Yes, sir.
We have to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen, for a very cogent presentation and for the way you've answered the question.
Thank you.
You mentioned the need for presidential leadership at a time when there are a lot of people in this country worried about the political weaponization of government agencies, EPA, IRS, FBI, and so on. And there are questions about the commitment of the current president to national security. Isn't it maybe providential that we don't yet have a DNI who has got the authority that might be misused? That's the first question. Second question, follow on what this gentleman said about groups in this country working to hobble our intelligence effort. I've heard both Clapper and Hayden just go to pieces when people have tried to ask them what we're doing to counter Muslim terrorism.
Right.
And you've got similar institutions in this country that are, not just Arab, but also Turkish institutions in this country, which are working at purposes that I think raise a lot of questions. So my second question is really, what, beyond the focus of your book, what is the purpose of our intelligence community? Are we serious about Russian, Iranian, Chinese?
Sure. Absolutely.
Efforts?
Absolutely.
And two, what are we doing about the very clear threat from Islam?
The purpose of the intelligence community is to collect information, usually abroad, that will give our policymakers a decision advantage in national security and foreign policy judgments. That's the purpose of the intelligence community. What the 9/11 Commission was going for, and decades of so-called reformers and practitioners are going for, is an intelligence community that acts and operates more coherently that we don't have different people off doing different things, that we share information in a way that the American people expect so that we keep the country safe. I'm not worried about a super spy master that controls everything so well that we're able to manipulate different sectors of our country or domestic institutions and the rest. I think the intelligence community does take very seriously Islamic terrorism and has been after it since 2001 and has really, frankly, over 2 presidents, done a pretty good job. And how do you measure that? That could be proved wrong next week, but there hasn't been another 9/11 styled attack in the United States. Is it necessarily because we have a DNI that the intelligence system has worked better? Not necessarily. It may be that we doubled funding to $80 billion and we got our act together and we learned the lessons of all the reports of what we did right and what we did wrong. But that's the purpose of the intelligence community. That's what they are fighting to be able to do, is to keep the people safe and to give our leaders as much information as they can get so that they can make better decisions on behalf of the country. So with that, I really enjoyed it, and thank you so much.